Okay, and I think it's high time to start. It's 2 p.m. here in Germany. And so it's my pleasure to introduce Eva Schultze-Berndt, who will be talking about another Australian language and of course word order, please.
Thank you. And I'm very excited about this workshop and all the work that's going on in token-based word order typology because of my long-term bafflement with the type-based kind of word order typology. So this is zooming into the top end of Northern Australia in the WALS database in a Dreyer's chapter on subject, verb, object order. And as you can see, there's supposedly quite some diversity of constituent orders represented here, including 2 of the only 11 languages in the world with supposedly OVS dominant constituent order. Now there is a lot of genealogical and typological variability between these languages as well, but still I've been puzzled by this. And I've actually went through the trouble of going back to the sources for a lot of these languages, and the evidence for a dominant order by Dreyer's definition or by any other definition is actually very thin. And I don't exclude myself here. So the data point on Jamjong Ngaliwuru that's circled in green there is based on my claim I made in my PhD dissertation that Jamjong doesn't have a dominant constituent order. And for the last 20 years, I had this nagging doubt that if I only did the corpus counting, maybe there would be a dominant order emerging. So now I've finally done the corpus counting and I can share it with you. So this is the language I'll be talking about. It's got a double name because speakers recognize 2 varieties, but in terms of mutual intelligibility, it's a single language. It's the only surviving member of the Western branch of the Mindi family, and it's very highly endangered. So the questions I'm going to ask and hopefully answer today are about the sort of basic frequencies of clause level constituent order patterns for this language, but also correlations of these orders with specific information structure patterns. And I will present some sort of general data, but also concentrate on core arguments and transitive clauses, because that's the basis for claims about a dominant order in transitive clauses, so where there's both a subject and an object present. So I'll start with some grammatical background. I'll talk about the data and then general results and results for transitive clauses and discuss some implications. In terms of grammatical background, well, not surprisingly, the first thing to notice that there's variable constituent order and also frequent omission of arguments, which also means that free pronouns are rarely used in discourse. They're only used for emphasis. Jamjong Ngaliwuru is a double marking language, which means it has both case marking and obligatory agreement or argument indexing on verbs for either 1 or 2 core arguments, depending on the transitivity. The case system is ergative absolutive, but there's actually optional or variable ergative marking of A in that it is not always present, and the absolutive case is always unmarked. There's no passive or antipassive construction, and there are also no clausal complements that one could sort of test for weight bias. So everything that would be done by clausal complement in English is usually done by direct speech. So here's an initial illustration of variable constituent order. The 3 examples here come from the same text by the same speaker, and it is about starting an Aboriginal settlement in the 1960s. So this is the SVO or AVP order. I will use the A and P abbreviations. This is the APV order with an additional A afterthought. And this illustrates the patient initial order, PAV. So in order to look at constituent order in a corpus, I followed the grade annotation system, which was devised by Jeff Haig and Stefan Schnell, who have very detailed guidelines for it. And basically just concentrating on how arguments are annotated, it distinguishes between the form of arguments, so whether it's a lexical noun phrase, a pronoun, or zero, that is omitted. It encodes animacy and person for first and second person, and it encodes grammatical role. So S, A, and P, and the extra possible distinctions which I have applied for secondary object and also for the speaker argument with verbs for framing direct speech. So X said, blah, 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 which behaves somewhat differently. So I've coded them as an additional category. And I've also added some information structure annotation. And this is based on joint work with Stefan Schnell and Ruth Singer in a couple of years ago, where we sort of looked at the possibility of adding information structure annotation to the grade system. And it's important to note from the outset that information structure here we really treat as distinct from referential accessibility, i.e. the distinction between given or new or anchored accessible. There is an annotation system that can be added to grade called referential index, which I haven't applied, that will encode that kind of information. So in terms of information structure annotation, the system is very simple to keep it practicable. So broad focus is not annotated. There's an annotation for narrow focus and for afterthought. I'll talk about this in a moment, how it's actually defined. And then also for left edge topics and for right edge topics. This glosses over a lot of issues with information structure, including contrastiveness, exhaustiveness, which are not included at the moment. So this is what the combined annotation looks like. That's the third line in the example. So a nominal expression has the form of a lexical noun phrase in the role of P, and the information structure function of topic. An agent, also for noun phrase, in the role of focus. The verb as predicate. In this example, another example of argument focus, and no annotation for what follows. And this is an example of broad focus, so no specific information structure annotation. And the example also illustrates that omitted arguments are also annotated. So in this case, the missing agent. So I'll talk a bit more about how the information structure categories are actually defined for the purpose of my annotation, because that's kind of crucial. That's a lot, well, probably not controversial for the definition of focus. So basically I use the answering an implicit or explicit question under discussion criterion for annotation of focus. And crucially, I've included the category of afterthought, which is a constituent that's prosodically detached from the comment and following the comment. For topic, things become a bit more hairy. The usual definition of topic is an expression which identifies an addition about which information is given, so in terms of aboutness. But when you actually look at corpus data, this becomes very difficult to apply, and people have written about this. So the additional criterion that I've used is informational separation from the comment. And that has a correlate in prosodic phrasing. So this leaves us with the two categories of left edge topics. So they're always initial, and they have the function of introducing a new address or changing the referent about which the following information is stored, but also they encode a frame or domain of relevance for the ream. And right edge topics or anti-topics, which have a slightly different function. They serve more to reactivate a discourse topic. So how does this work for Jamindung and Ngaliburu? Thankfully, Candide Simard has done detailed work on prosody and information structure in this language. So there's a fairly clear correlate for focal constituents in that they have a salient falling contour associated with them. And a left edge topic is then a constituent that precedes this initial focal contour. So this is what it looks like for a topicless clause. So just a comment, and you can see the falling contour very clearly. And this is what a topic comment bipartite clause looks like, where the focal high start and falling contour follows the topic. So using this criterion, it was quite possible to annotate, well, to identify topics in the spoken corpus. The other categories I'll briefly mention anti-topics. So they also follow a clear prosodic break and have a low, relatively flat contour, so no focal pitch reset. Whereas afterthoughts are focal constituents that kind of expand the ream or comment, and they frequently are repeated or stacked one after the other. They can also be distributed over several speakers. So this is an example of a picture description that two speakers co-constructed, and I've color-coded the different speakers. And all but the initial units are actually afterthoughts. So this immediately raises the question, which I'll leave dangling for today. How do we encode this in terms of constituent order? Do we include fragmented utterances of this type? Or do we use a more stringent criterion of identifying a core prosodic unit that kind of gets planned and produced in one fell swoop? I have included them in my annotation just to give me more data, but that's clearly an issue. Oh, this is just the illustration of the pitch contour of the example that I just played. So the data that I've annotated, the corpus data, all spoken data that have audio aligned transcriptions in ELAN. There are 37 texts from different genres. In total, 2,449 annotation units, of which I'm only going to talk about the finite clauses. And of those also excluding imperatives and relative clauses, because we expect a missing argument in these, so they're not included in the counts. And the sort of subset of clauses with 2 overt arguments that I look at is just 95 clauses, which means 2 overt arguments are actually vanishingly rare in the corpus. So the overall results, just for the different roles that are introduced, agent, patient, ditransitive, secondary object, subject of speech framing verb, and subject in intransitive verb. The figures for these are very different. So these are the raw figures. And what's obvious at first glance is that A, there's variable order between pre-verbal and post-verbal position of each of the constituents, and B, that the vast majority of them are actually 0 or omitted. Now, if we zoom in on the constituent order of just the clauses with 2 overt arguments, so that was only 95 of them, the following orders appear, or the following frequencies of orders appear. So these are still the raw frequencies. So ABP, or SVO if you like, is the most frequent order, followed by APV and PVA, followed by PAV and the verb initial orders. And luckily, I don't have to revise my statement for the, that was taken as a data point for the Walls Atlas, because none of these constituent orders is twice as frequent as any of the others, or none of these is, the highest frequency is not twice as frequent as the next highest. So by Dreyer's criterion, that means there is no dominant constituent order in Jamindong. So the initial observations are, the data confirm the existence of free constituent order at clause level. And by the way, it's also variable at other levels, but I'm not talking about these. It shows that A initial patterns are strongly preferred in these transitive clauses, which one might link to a sort of generally observed cross-linguistic preference for subject initial order in transitive clauses. And also contiguity of verb and object are strongly preferred. By contiguity, I don't necessarily mean immediate contiguity, but they're not interrupted by the agent argument. Also, verb initial patterns are very strongly dispreferred. So the data might, at first instance, be taken to confirm the so-called agent first bias that has been claimed in the literature on the basis of experiments, which those that I've looked at, the studies I've looked at, they were presented in written form. But this doesn't take into account information structure. So what if it's not agent initial order that's preferred, but topic initial order, and agents happen to be topics, or topics happen to be agents? And that seems to be indeed the case. So if we take into account topicality in this data set of just transitive clauses, the topic initial clauses outnumber the non-topic initial ones for the agents, but not for the other, for the agent initial orders, but not for the other orders. So in this data set, the majority of agents are topics. So this does not surprise us, because it's long been known that agents are topics, but I'd like to throw a note of caution in the, or spanner in the works here, because that correlation, at least for the Jamindong corpus, only holds for the 2 argument clauses. So if you look in the wider corpus, also the non-topical agents are much more frequent than the topical agents. And the same holds for the other roles. So the majority of overt agents are actually not topics. So it's not just a simple correlation between agenthood and topichood. It is the case that agents and intransitive subjects are more likely to be topics than patients. So to sum up, if we take into account information structure, the superficial prevalence of agent initial orders, but also patient v agent order in German Jungali is the result of three tendencies. The first, if you have two argument clauses with two overt arguments, they tend to have left edge topics. Otherwise, people just don't produce two arguments in a single clause. And then if you have a topic, an agent is more likely to be the topic than a patient. And also, and this may be more language specific, two arguments on one side of the verb are dispreferred unless one of them is a topic. So from Jamindung, can we make generalizations to constituent order more generally? These are very tentative. So first of all, I'm assuming here that languages actually have similar basic information structure patterns, which are that the topic is initial as defined above, and that afterthought and anti-topic are distinguished and both available. So the second generalization, the generalization then could be that any universal preference for initial A's might be an epiphenomenon which is due to the frequency of A's in topic position, at least in two argument clauses, maybe not across the board in corpora. And any agent first bias may actually be a topic first bias. Whereas languages might be more variable in the order of rhematic constituents. I'd like to conclude with a couple of methodological implications. So for corpora, well, I hope I have convinced you that it's desirable to have annotations, not just for constituent order, but also information structure. It's a lot of work. I agree with that. But very specifically, I think this frequent claim that agents are topics, which is also often invoked as explanation for preferred constituent order, needs to be subject to empirical scrutiny. And it needs to be made clear what definition of the topic or of topic it is actually based on. So do we talk about overt sentence topics or covert discourse topics? And do we include informational separation or edge position in our definition for topics? The second question that I raised and that I don't really have an answer for is what to do with highly fragmented spoken utterances, those that have lots of afterthoughts, like I illustrated. For experimental work, I think there's also methodological implications. So if we test participants on written data, they need to be able to map an appropriate information structure for a given order. So the results will depend on their ability to do that if there is variability in the language according to information structure. And the same for spoken data, the results might change if the speaker who produces the materials captures or does not quite as well capture the appropriate information structure for each constituent order. For picture description tasks, I wonder if there is a tendency for a topic comment partition of transitive scenes, even if there's supposedly all new information, and that this may lead in this kind of task to a predominance of agent or subject initial order. So I'll stop here and I'm looking forward to the discussion. I'd like to acknowledge people that I've worked with over the years.
Okay, many thanks, Eva. That's really great. And I think it's kind of research that is really, really badly needed at the moment. And it's also very time consuming, but I think it's also very rewarding at the same time. So thanks for that. So are there any, I think there are some questions. Okay, there's one from Rachel, please go ahead. I think you can unmute yourself.
Yeah, hi, thanks Eva. I was just wondering whether you had a look at, because I see you coded your noun phrases for animacy and pronoun and lexical noun and so forth. And I was wondering if you had a look at whether there were any correlations there with the word orders. Because we found, for example, that in our experimental data, you're more likely to get the patient initial word orders when you've got human patients that are being acted on by non-human agents and so on. So I was wondering if you'd had a chance in your data to have a look for that sort of, any of interactions like that.
Yeah, I haven't looked at that yet, but I suspect there will be a correlation, and that it will also correlate with topichood. So if there's a human patient, it's more likely to be the topic, I suspect, but I can extract this from the data, but I haven't done that work yet.
Thanks, it'll be interesting to see.
There is another question here in the chat. Could you give more details about your afterthought category? What relation does it have with the comment unit, main illocutionary unit?
Yeah, so it's a tricky one. I counted everything as an afterthought that has this prosodic contour that so basically starts a new unit. So in that sense, they're new units. But semantically, they are, well, formally they are fragmented, so they're not whole clauses. And semantically, these units somehow furnish additional information to what has preceded. So that's why they're labeled afterthought. It's not a label that I've come up with. But yeah, I think from the point of view of processing, if we're talking about order or ease of processing of order, one might be tempted to separate them out rather than include them with the preceding unit. In terms of semantic relationships, dependency relationships, whatever, one might be tempted to include them. Does that answer your question?
Well, I hope so. We'll see some comments maybe in the chat, and maybe you can continue the discussion too there and have a look. And there's maybe yes, so it was Dariana. She confirmed that she's happy with your answer. And there's another question from Chao Li. So in the clauses with two avert arguments, the data does support the agent first principle if we ignore the information status of the agents, right? So I think maybe you can read it too in your chat if it's too long.
Yes. Basically, yes, but I would argue that the agent first bias is an epiphenomenon of the topic first, of the prevalence of topic initial clauses in this type of data set, plus the bias that topics tend to be agents.
Okay.
Or at least likely than topics being patients.
All right, thanks. I think we have to move on with this, but I also would like to ask you, Eva, so first of all, thank you very much again. And I also like to ask you some questions, so maybe we can discuss that in chat later. Okay, thanks, great. And then the next presenter can start sharing the screen, yes.